Hi, everyone. Welcome to Podcast UFO. Michael Lauk will be joining us in a few minutes. I'm Martin Willis. Today's a special program. It's episode number 50, and it's mostly a science program with Dr. Seth Shostak. He is the Senior Astronomer of SETI. And so, how you doing, Michael?
Good. How are you doing this week?
Good. And what's up for the news this week?
Well, we have a lot, but first I'd like to remind listeners that they can learn more about all of our stories through the links we have provided in the show notes available at podcastufo.com. While there, be sure to sign up for our forums. Now, this week's almost all science-themed news. First of all, we have a weather satellite failure. A National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration severe weather tracking satellite, which covers the eastern part of the United States, has failed. A spare satellite has been activated, though, so there is no immediate danger, despite the fact that it is the beginning of hurricane season.
So I think that's interesting. They have a spare satellite. I mean, I wonder if it's like just floating there, turned off, just waiting for this moment.
Evidently, it's kind of in the middle of the country as opposed to the east or the west. And if they have to, they can even tip it one direction or the other, but they are hoping to get the regular East Coast satellite back online.
Yeah, I haven't checked, but I wonder if there's any more news about the Kepler. Have you heard anything about that?
No, I haven't yet, and I did look.
So they're probably just still trying to work things out.
Probably. And speaking of NASA, should they skip the asteroid and just go straight back to the moon? On Tuesday, May 21st, members of the U.S. House of Representatives Science, Space, and Technology Committee questioned the merit of NASA's project to capture an asteroid, and some called for a return to the moon instead of capturing an asteroid as a step towards Mars. Did you actually see anything about this?
Not really, no. So I'm a little confused here. Are they saying that they want to skip capturing an asteroid and work on going to the moon?
Some of the representatives were questioning whether capturing an asteroid was really a valid step towards Mars, and didn't it make perhaps more sense to set up a moon base that we could launch from, that we could train astronauts to be in a lower gravity, and many other benefits of that. It seemed to kind of slip under the radar, but I thought it was a pretty interesting discussion. And, of course, there's a link to a full article in our show notes.
I would think that it would make sense to, work from the moon. It's almost like a training session before we actually step out toward Mars. That's, my thoughts in general. And besides, if they do capture an asteroid and fling it around the moon, work on mining that, there's a lot of great resources they can get from that. Plus, isn't there something that is on the moon that's very valuable?
Right, helium-3.
That's it, yeah.
Yes, and frankly, if to be a bit nationalistic for a moment, we don't want the Chinese to kind of be the monopoly on that. I'm all for a moon base, personally.
Wow. So we might have like Moon War 1.
It sounds like the stuff of science fiction, but Lord knows that one day it is the way we're going, a real possibility. Yeah, and to continue with some NASA news, they announced plans recently to allow commercial space companies to rent access to the historic Launch Pad 39A at the Kennedy Space Center. This arrangement will allow the agency to maintain the facility while giving newer space enterprises a more affordable way to launch their vehicles.
I think that's pretty green of them. What do you think?
I think it's pretty exciting, actually. And it makes so much sense that it's hard to believe a government agency came up with it.
Yeah, it's probably because there are funding issues.
It's exactly what it is.
Yeah, they just have to think out of the box a little more to try to make things work.
I honestly kind of wonder if the commercial companies didn't come to them and ask for it. But
that very well could be. That makes sense, actually. Yeah.
But I might be a little unfair to NASA. I can't pretend to really know their inner workings.
Well, just remember the conspiracy started here.
That's right.
Yeah.
And one more bit of space news here. The Herschel Space Observatory, which is a European space agency project with some NASA participation, has captured images of the collision of two galaxies approximately 11 billion light years from Earth. It has been suggested that collisions such as this are responsible for giant elliptical-shaped galaxies that were apparently common in the early stages of our universe.
Yeah, this is fascinating. I was following this, and they're seeing starbursts. Actually, on the show notes, if you follow that link, you'll see some images of it. To put how vast just our galaxy on, since this is a science-related podcast, I was looking at it, 600,000 trillion miles across the Milky Way, which is about 100 or 120,000 light years. Isn't that amazing if you think about all the galaxies out there?
Yeah, and the other thing that always gets me with things like this is when we're getting images from 11 billion light years away, those are images that are 11 billion years old.
That's right.
And
Yep.
that's just crazy to think about.
I remember the first time I stepped into an observatory and looked up at Andromeda. I was looking at light that took, millions of years to get to that telescope lens. It's an amazing feeling when you really think about it.
It is. It's a bit humbling.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, to rebel against your science, the UPI reported last Friday, May 24th, on a UFO spotted over a California historic site. The Edgemoor Barn is now part of a museum complex in Santee, California, and has, according to the article, had ghost sightings in the past, but never a UFO. You can see the photograph of the oval flying object and a YouTube collage of photographs related to the sighting in the original UPI article. Like all of today's articles, you will find a link to it in our show notes. Did you get a chance to see that picture?
Oh, yes. It really does look disc-shaped. This was a photograph that was taken when they didn't even spot anything. He saw something on his viewer, and then when he put it on his computer and expanded it, he saw the disc-shaped item and didn't see it with the naked eye. And that reminds me of, some other things that have been taken like that. For instance, I'm not going to talk about the Denver one because that one is controversial. But There was a Chilean one a few years ago that was highly investigated, that was a video slowdown, and they saw, objects. Maybe these things are just flying so fast, whatever they are, that they just can't be captured with the naked eye.
That's true. And also in this one, I didn't get the impression that he didn't see it because he was looking there, but it's just he didn't notice it so much because he was taking pictures of this barn. No investigation, I am now making no claims of its legitimacy, but so far it is my favorite UFO picture of the year, probably just because it's like classic saucery looking too.
Yeah, it really does have that shape. A few minutes ago, I was talking about the Chilean report, and
right.
I have some exciting news. Next week is going to be an awesome podcast. We have 3 people on that are just amazing, and the first one I'm going to talk about is Jose Lai. Now, he's the International Affairs Director of the Chilean government that investigates unidentified aerial phenomena, or UFOs. He's going to be on. After him is Dr. Alexander Wendt. He talks about the militant agnosticism and the UFO taboo. Very interesting guy. And one I'm really excited about is General de Brouwer, the UFO wave over Belgium. We're going to have those 3 guests on in one podcast.
Wow. That is going to be a really, really interesting podcast.
I'm excited about it.
I mean, I vividly remember seeing de Brouwer on CNN during all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, as vividly as I remembered Norman Schwarzkopf in Desert Storm.
Yeah.
That honestly, that is something that if you know somebody who is kind of into UFOs or kind of on the fence and they don't listen to the show, get them to listen to that show because I think that's going to be a big deal.
Yeah, it's great. Well, thanks so much, Michael.
Well, thank you, and I look forward to your interview with Dr. Shostak.
You bet. I'm on Skype again with Seth Shostak. How are you, Seth?
Hi, Martin. I'm fine. Thank you.
Thanks for coming back after our debate last time. If someone wants to hear us debate about UFOs, they can go back to archived episode number 22. Basically, that debate was that you don't really think we're being visited by extraterrestrials, and I think it's possible. That's kind of in a nutshell. But one of the things we both agree on is, I believe we do anyway, is that we both believe that there is intelligent life out there somewhere. And so can you describe exactly what SETI has done and what it is doing today to try to find it?
Well, sure. The SETI Institute, which is, by the way, where I'm speaking to you from, located here in the Silicon Valley, is interested in life in space. And in fact, not just intelligent life in space. The majority of the scientists here are thinking about life that might not be terribly intelligent, but might be closer by, like life on Mars, some of the moons of Saturn and Jupiter, and so forth. So the majority of the scientists here actually are studying those sorts of questions. But there is also our SETI group. That's what the Institute is perhaps best known for. I'm part of that group. And the SETI group, although rather numerically small, is indeed trying to find some cosmic company by eavesdropping on radio signals. That's what we're looking for these days, although in the past we've looked for other kinds of signals. But radio signals, we're just trying to do what Jodie Foster did in the movie Contact and pick up some signals from space that would tell us that there's somebody out there at least clever enough to build a transmitter that we could hear.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that just comes to mind, I know there's a lot of things I want to talk to you about because there's a lot going on in the field of astronomy in general. This is probably really a layman's question, but if Kepler happens to find an exoplanet that is possibly habitable, do you actually work with NASA to redirect, like, say, the Allen telescope array?
Yes, well, that is the antenna that we're using for our SETI experiments, the Allen telescope array. And in fact, we don't even have to work terribly closely with the NASA guys doing Kepler because many of our scientists here are involved directly with Kepler. They're working for Kepler. So it's sort of an inside connection. And indeed, when they find a possibly habitable world, of course, it's on our list. We're looking at many of the planet candidates. Most of them are candidates. They're not yet confirmed with telescopes here on the ground, but many of the Kepler candidates. And here's the bottom line. I mean, we found one way or another, mostly through Kepler, something like 9 planets that might be habitable. Now, the number of confirmed planets that have been found in toto is like 900. Okay. I mean, there are thousands of additional candidates, but they haven't yet been confirmed. So let's be conservative. 900 planets found, 9 of them might be habitable. That sounds like 1% of all planets are habitable. Well, that's a very crude estimate because it's based on, limited data so far. But, that means there are going to be a lot of them out there, given that there are probably 1 trillion planets in the galaxy. Then maybe 10 billion of them are habitable. But of course we look at them. Of course we do. Yes.
Yeah. I know there's the wobble on how they actually figure out how close this planet is, the mass of it and all that. And do you happen to know how they actually figure out if it's a rocky planet or instead of a gaseous one?
Well, yeah, you do that not so much because you can actually see that or even directly measure it. But what you can measure, depending on how you find the planet, of course, but what you can measure is its size. For example, if you're finding it with Kepler, because how does Kepler work? It just stares at 150,000 stars. It just measures how bright each of those stars is, roughly every 30 seconds. It makes another measurement. It's like a giant light meter in space, okay? And if it sees that, wait a minute, this star, which was this brightness for days and days and days, suddenly got a little bit dimmer, maybe 1 part in 10,000 dimmer. So it's a very small change, but it can measure that. And it gets dimmer for, who knows, 5, 10 hours, and then it got brighter again. Then you say, well, something got in front of it. Something blocks some of the light from this thing, and that's a planet. Now, you assume that the planets are round because we don't find planets that are shaped like, I don't know, pyramids or Mount Rushmore or anything like that. They're round, okay? The star's round, so that's just really a junior high school, middle school geometry to figure out how big the planet is. And if it's something the size of Jupiter, everything we know about planets suggests it's probably like Jupiter. It's mostly a ball of gas. But if it's small, well, then it's likely to be a rocky planet. Now, the thing is that the other way of finding planets, where you just look at the wobble of the star, that gives you some idea of the mass, how heavy it is. So if you have the mass and you have the size, then you can work out, well, what's the density of this thing? Is it like rock or is it like gas? Because there's quite a bit of difference in the density. And so, using those kinds of techniques, you can occasionally frequently tell, actually, whether the planet is likely to be a rocky planet like the Earth, which is, pretty solid, or it's some sort of gas ball like, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, or Neptune.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, I heard the company named Skytree is going to be helping sort through the data. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I don't know exactly what Skytree is going to do. There are all sorts of ways of sorting through this data. The Kepler data are publicly available, many of the data are. And so people have been looking through them, people who aren't actually connected with the Kepler project directly, but they go through it and look at, for example, how many planets are being found around a certain kind of star. There was a team at Harvard, the Center for Astrophysics at Harvard, that did this, and Courtney Dressing and David Charbonneau. And what they found was, for example, something very interesting, that something like 6% of all the red dwarf stars, these are the tiniest stars in the universe, that 6% of them have planets that might be habitable. That's amazing. If that holds up, and it looks pretty good. If that holds up, I mean, these are 3/4 of all stars are these little red dwarf guys, and if 6% of them have habitable planets, again, that's billions of habitable planets just in our galaxy. So those are the kinds of things that you can use the Kepler data for. I mean, it's being used by many people looking for many different things.
It almost makes you feel not so special to be Earth when you hear that data. Can we talk about, I think it was back in 77 or whenever it was, the WOW signal. When did you start working at SETI?
Well, I didn't start working here at the SETI Institute till about 1990, 1991. I had done a SETI experiment in 1981. I was living in Europe at the time. I wasn't here in